I set my GPS to bring me over here this morning, and I was driving, and I saw Church of Christ, and I pulled in. And I went into the building, and I said, "I'm your guest speaker here today." And they looked at me like I was crazy, and they said, "We don't have a guest speaker here today." And I said, "Isn't half of the church on a retreat?" And they said, "No." Well, it turned out I was at the wrong congregation this morning. And so that's why I, in a panic, went back out and got in the car and headed over here. And I thought, oh, I'm going to be late. So I got here right at 9 o'clock. So my apologies. There's so many congregations around here. And I just saw the first one, and I had been driving about the right amount of time. And so I went there. It is good to be here with you today. Boy, it is empty in here today. It looks like everyone on the right side went on the retreat, and everyone on the left side stayed here. So I appreciate the invitation. In the class today, we are going to talk about something that is maybe a little bit out of the news, that is out of the norm to discuss, but it is something that is very relevant in our society, and that is the subject of homosexuality. June in our country now has been set aside as Pride Month. And I want to share some statistics with you. Beginning in 1999, I'll hold off on those for a minute. Beginning in 1999, President Bill Clinton officially declared the month of June as Gay Pride Month, Gay and Lesbian Pride Month. In 2009, President Barack Obama expanded that designation to LGBT Pride Month, recognizing a broader spectrum of identities. In 2021, President Biden issued a presidential proclamation recognizing it as LGBTQ+ Pride Month, explicitly recognizing the struggles and achievements of this community, if you want to call it that. And then in 2022, 23, and 24, he repeatedly reaffirmed the LGBTQ rights and pressed for equality. In 2025, when Trump took control, the U.S. Department of Education declared June as Title IX month, and that is, he started rolling things back. The FBI said they did not want LGBTQ Pride Month celebrated on company time. In fact, they would not allow it. The Department of Justice stripped Harvey Milk's name off of a ship that was honoring gay rights. And so one of the Navy ships was honoring a gay rights activist, and they said no more. They changed the name. Now, I want to ask you this question as we begin this morning. Do you believe that the homosexual push and the agenda has been effective in this country? Okay, it has absolutely been effective. Let me show you these statistics now. Support for gay marriage in 1988, I was in high school in 1988, support for gay marriage, they say, was 11%. I grew up in a conservative area of the country, as this is, and I guarantee it was not 11% where I grew up. I had never met a homosexual in my whole life in 1988, at least not that I knew of, but they say that it was 11%. In 2021, it was 70%. See if I updated the figure here. In 2023, it was 71%. Looks like I've got two different PowerPoints mixed up here, but in 2021, it was 73%. Those who favored same-sex marriage in 2021, 84% of young adults, 72% of middle-aged adults, and 60% of older adults. A Gallup poll, when they broke it down by political parties, said in 2021, 83% of Democrats supported gay marriage, 73% of independents, and 55% of Republicans. And so even in the Republican Party, the majority now supports gay marriage. How did we get to that point? If you look at 1988 to to 2021 or 23, depending on which statistics we're looking at, it's really not that long of a period of time. And yet, we really made a leap in this country. Do we as members of the Lord's church need to be talking about this? Yes, we do. How often do we talk about it? It's rare. This is something that we rarely preach about. It is something that we rarely talk about. It's something that we also need to be talking to our kids about because it is a serious problem in this country. And so what I want to do this morning is to discuss the effects that this has been having on the Lord's church, and I want to talk about some problems that have been put forth, arguments that are being made in defense of homosexuality. In fact, what time does the class go to? 9:45. So I've got about 30 minutes. I'll tell you what I'm going to do because I thought I had a little bit more time than that. So I'm going to skip some of the introductory material and I'm going to jump right into the meat of this lesson. I have 9 arguments that have been made in defense of homosexuality. Now I want to tell you where I collected these arguments. I went on social media, and many of these date back to 2015 when the Supreme Court decided that homosexuality and gay marriage was going to be the law of the land. And from that time, people started posting arguments to defend this. I've got 9 arguments defending specifically homosexuality and gay marriage. Now you might say, well, what's the big deal? There's lots of arguments. Almost every single one of these arguments, maybe 8 out of the 9, were made by members of the church. These are members of the Lord's church who are defending gay marriage. Now, brethren, that's disturbing to me. Now, almost, in fact, I guess every one of them were made by younger members of the Lord's church. In 2015, when the gay marriage law was changed in this country and the Supreme Court said it's going to be the law of the land, my daughter Macy was a student at Freed-Hardeman University. And I was talking to her on the phone one day about this and how shocked I was. And she said, Dad, there's great support for this at Freed-Hardeman. And I said, I don't believe that, Macy. That is shocking. Out of all the universities in America, surely Freed-Hardeman is one of the most conservative. And she said, Dad, I am telling you, I'm a student here. I'm on campus. I talk to other students. I see it. I'm telling you, there is great support for this. Later, I talked to Brother Dan Winkler, who was teaching there, and I said, my daughter said there's great support for this on campus. Is that true? And he said, oh yeah, that's true, Don. And he said, remember that a college campus is nothing but a microcosm of society. And I got to thinking about that. What is the age of college students? 18 to 22. And I got to thinking in 2015, if you go back 20 years, that takes you back to about 1995. My daughter was born in 1994. So what does that mean? For their entire lifespan, they had been taught that this is normal, this is right. If you oppose this, you are a bigot. And so they'd seen it on television, they'd seen it in social media. It would be natural that they would support this. Now, the older you go, the less support there is for it. In my generation, we never heard that. People did not support it. It was not viewed as okay. If you go back to my generation, Generation X, support for it is much lower. If you go to the baby boomers, support is even lower. So what I'm going to do is we're going to look at these arguments. Most of them were made by millennials or younger, and we're going to talk about them. So here is the first argument that I saw made, and that is that all sins are the same in the eyes of God. No one sin is worse than another. Why did people make this argument? What they were saying is, we don't know why you Generation X and boomers, we don't know why you're so upset about gay marriage. It's not like it's worse than any other sin. All sins are the same in the eyes of God. Have you ever heard that argument? Raise your hand if you've heard that. All sins are the same in the eyes of God. Okay, some have. A few people apparently haven't heard it, but this is an argument I have heard many times. I'm not sure where this argument comes from because there is no verse in the Bible that teaches it. I guess I do know where it comes from. It's from the idea that any sin can cause a man to be lost, and certainly that is true. Any sin, from the least to the greatest, can cause a man to go to hell eternally. But it is simply not true that God views all sins the same. If I were to show you a verse in the Bible that said this, specifically from Jesus himself, that ought to settle it, right? Well, that's what I want to do. In John 19 and verse 11, Jesus was standing in the presence of Pilate, and this is what he says to him. You could have no power at all against me unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, the one who has delivered me to you, he is guilty of the greater sin. I want you to notice that Jesus said that one sin could be greater than another sin. Now, we could stop right there, and that would settle the argument, right? God doesn't view all sins the same. Jesus says some sins are greater than other sins. But I want to keep going here. In 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 13, Paul writes to Timothy, but evil men and impostors grow worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived. Here's my question. If God views all sins equally, how could a person grow worse? It seems like there'd just be a level. There'd be nothing less than that, and there'd be nothing greater if all sins are the same in the eyes of God. How about this? Psalm 19, the King James describes what is called secret and presumptuous sins. Now, that language in the King James is a little bit deceiving to us because we would say it differently. What he means instead of secret and presumptuous is sins of ignorance and sins of full knowledge. Sometimes you sin and you don't know it's a sin. Sometimes you do know it's a sin and you do it anyway. Psalm 19 and verse 13 calls the sin of full knowledge. In other words, when you know it's a sin and you do it anyway, it refers to it as the great transgression. Now, what does that mean? If you commit a sin of ignorance, it's still a sin. But if you know it's a sin and you shake your fist in the face of God and say, I'm going to do it anyway, God views that more seriously. And we understand that, don't we? If we were dealing with our own kids and we told them, don't do so, and they say, well, Dad, I didn't know that was wrong. You would say, well, it's wrong, just don't do it. Okay, it's all right. But if you told them, don't you dare do that, and they said, I'll do what I want to do you view those two things the same? We don't view those the same, and neither does God. That is the point. God doesn't view all sins the same. How about this? Proverbs chapter 6 and verse 16 says, these 6 things doth the Lord hate, yea, 7 are an abomination to him. What we have there is a list of 7 things that God finds particularly offensive to him. He says these sins are way up there. Here's the top 7 sins that are offensive to me. If God views all sins the same, what's the point of that list? I don't even understand the point of it if he views all sins the same. How about this? Exodus chapter 32 and verse 30. Moses is up on the mountain receiving the 10 commandments. When he is up on the mountain, do you remember what the children of Israel were doing at the base of the mountain? You remember, what were they doing? They were building the golden calf. And so Moses comes down and he sees them building the golden calf, and they're dancing around it, and they're engaging in immorality, and they're worshiping this idol that they had built. And this is what Moses says in Exodus 32 and verse 21. He says to his brother Aaron, how have you sinned and brought so great a sin upon the people? That is, he says, Aaron, you've done a very serious thing. This is a great sin. This is way up there. You have made an idol, and you remember what he said? He said, this is the God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. He says this is way serious. This is not a regular sin. This is a seriously high sin. How about this? 1 Samuel chapter 2, 22 through 24 discusses the fact that some sins are against other men and some sins are against God. Now, I'm not going to get into the difference right now, except to say not all sins are the same. God views them differently. 1 John chapter 5 and verse 16 says, there's a sin unto death, there's a sin not unto death. What does that mean? Not all sins are the same. How about this one? 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 20, Peter talks about a person who becomes a Christian and then he goes back into his former sin, and the Bible says the latter end is worse with them than the beginning. It would have been better for him not to have known the way of righteousness than after having known it to turn from the holy commandment delivered unto him. One more. 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 8 says, if any man will not provide for his own, especially those of his own household, he has denied the faith, and he is what? Worse than an unbeliever. If a man won't take care of his own house, he is worse than an unbeliever. Why is that? A person who doesn't even believe in God will take care of his own house. See, not all sins are the same. He said one can be worse than another. You see, the Bible is filled with passages that teach not all sins are the same in the eyes of God. Let me ask you this question. If you see a man running a red light, and you see another man sexually molesting a child, do you think those are the same? Do you view those things the same? I don't view those things the same, and God doesn't view those the same either. We need to stop saying that God views all sins the same, because the Bible does not teach that. Some sins are more offensive and more egregious in the eyes of God than are others, and I could give you 100 verses in the Bible that say that. All right, here's the next one. Sometimes I've heard people say this, well, homosexuals are not hurting anybody, so why don't you just mind your own business? It is said by people who defend homosexuality, and particularly gay marriage, that it doesn't hurt anybody else. Just let them live their lives. But the fact is, it is hurting us. In fact, it's hurting the entire country. Proverbs 14 and verse 34 says, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. Homosexual marriage is an attack on the very foundation of the country itself. The building block of a country is the home, and homosexuality is an attack on the home. In fact, in 2005, a report was done that found, listen to this, quote, a number of studies performed over a period spanning more than half a century, many of which were even performed by homosexuals and sympathizers, has shown that an extremely large percentage of sexually active homosexuals also participate in sexually molesting children. What does that mean? If you look at the percentage of people who are homosexuals, a large percentage of them also sexually molest children. Now, should that be shocking to us? It shouldn't be shocking. One thing I've said many times is sexual perversion begets sexual perversion. Perversion begets perversion. If a person is involving in themselves in sexual perversion, it just grows. You don't reach a level and you just stop there and say, this is the level that I'm at. In fact, the Nebraska Medical Journal has statistics that say homosexuals are 8 to 12 times more likely to molest children than are heterosexuals. 8 to 12 times more likely. You know, I gave some of these statistics one time, and somebody came to me afterwards. They said, well, I searched those things online, and I couldn't find it. I've got documentation and resources, the journals. If somebody wants to see it, I've got detailed statistics for all of this. You might say, I want to see it because I'm teaching some folks or I'm working on a paper or whatever. I'd like to have this documentation. I'll be glad to share this with you. In 2015, the year that the Supreme Court made this ruling, at that time, the Boy Scouts of America decided that they were going to follow suit and they would allow gay scoutmasters into the Boy Scouts. In a 45-12 vote, they ended the ban on homosexual scout leaders. Fast forward from 2015 until 2020, 5 years later, the Boy Scouts of America filed bankruptcy. Do you know why? Because they had so many lawsuits of sexual abuse scandals and sexual molestation of Boy Scout leaders against Boy Scouts. In fact, the last statistic that I saw, and I'll give you the reference for the statistic if you want it, showed that the number of lawsuits for sex abuse against Boy Scouts, the number of lawsuits had surpassed 82,000. And it got to the point that the Boy Scouts filed bankruptcy. What is my point? My point is this: when people say homosexuality is not hurting anybody, that is a lie. I myself, when I was a teenager, the first time I ever met a homosexual, I was at an event. I worked for Walmart, and I was at an event, and a homosexual followed me home to my house and got out and approached me and gave me his phone number and asked me if I would like to go out with him. So when someone says homosexuals are not hurting anybody, I would say that is not true. It does not. I was shocked. I'd never met one before. 8 to 12 times more likely to molest children. It is a lie that they are minding their own business. And I've got lots of statistics to show that. I got to get rolling here. Next, people will say, well, they were just born that way. They were made that way, and they can't help it, so we've just got to let them be. First, we can show biblically that this is not true. Secondly, we can show scientifically that this is not true. Biblically, let me show you this. In Romans chapter 1 and verse 26, the Bible talks about homosexuality. Listen what it says. For this reason, God gave them up. It's talking about the ancient Gentiles. God gave them up to vile passions. For even their women exchanged the natural use into that which is against nature. Now, he's talking about lesbians in verse 26. He says, not that they were born that way, but he says they exchanged the natural use of that for which is against nature. Now, that's very key. He says they exchanged it. What does that mean? It was a choice. It was something that they chose to do. God didn't make them that way. Listen to verse 27 as he talks about men. Likewise also men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another, men working with men that which is shameful, and receiving in themselves the penalty of their error which was due. Notice that it says that the men left the natural use of the woman. He doesn't say they were born that way. He doesn't say God made them that way. They made a conscious decision to do this. What does that mean? The idea that they were born that way is a false one. Several years ago, there was an international consortium put together to map the human genome. You know what the human genome is? It is all the DNA in the human body. And they were going to say what it all linked to, what all of it caused. One of the things that they were expecting, the liberal news media was expecting that there would be found a gay gene. When they told us what every gene did, they were expecting that there was a gay gene. After they got through mapping all the genes and the human genome, do you know what they never did find? There's no gay gene. There was nothing genetically to say a person is born gay because of their genetics. There is nothing like that. So what does cause a person to be gay? There have been a lot of studies, and I've got probably 20 or 30 minutes of material, in fact, probably several hours if we wanted to get detailed. But basically, it comes down to two things. Psychologist Joseph Nicolosi said this: in 15 years, I have studied hundreds of homosexual men. Perhaps there are exceptions, but I have never met a single homosexual man that had a close, loving, and respectful relationship with his father. So while there is some inconsistency in studies about mothers, one virtually unchanging variable is poor relationship with fathers. Fathers are often instrumental in causing GID, that is gender identity disorder, and homosexual attraction. He said one of the breakdowns is the role of the father. You've got a bad father, an abusive father, an absentee father, especially a father who abuses his children physically or sexually. He said that is one of the major factors. The second factor, statistics reveal that sexual abuse is a significant contributing factor in causing gender identity disorder. One study on sexual behavior in the United States revealed that sexual molestation of a child made him 3 times more likely to identify as gay or lesbian. So 2 main factors that they've determined, one of them is sexual abuse, and the other is a dysfunctional home, particularly if you've got an abusive or absentee father. Now, some of this information, I wish I had more time, and maybe if there's an opportunity or interest, we could go into some of these journals to show the studies that have been done by doctors and scientists that back up this information. But in brief, what is the point here? The idea that they were born that way is simply not, is there a laser on here? Yeah, that they were born that way is simply not supported by science, and it is not supported by the Bible. Here's the fourth one. Some people have said, well, the Bible doesn't actually condemn homosexuality. The first time I heard this, I was shocked. And so what will happen is this. Maybe you're talking to a friend about gay marriage, about this question, and you say, well, I oppose gay marriage. And they say, why? And you say, because the Bible opposes it. And they say, where? And you say, well, you know, Sodom and Gomorrah. God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah for homosexuality. And your friend says, no, he didn't. And you say, of course he did. And they say, no, he didn't. And this is what happened to me. I was sitting in a Bible class in the Lord's church, and someone said this exact same thing. They said God did not destroy Sodom and Gomorrah for homosexuality. And I was waiting eagerly. I wasn't teaching the class. I was just sitting in the class, and they said, I'll prove it. And they read Ezekiel chapter 16 and verse 49. I'm going to read it to you. It says, look, this was the sin of Sodom. She and her daughter had pride and abundance of food and abundance of idleness, and she did not strengthen the hand of the poor and needy. And this woman said, that's the reason that God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. She said, we always say that God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah for homosexuality, but the Bible specifically tells us, look, this was the sin of Sodom. How do you answer that? I tell you what, I started searching my Bible. My heart was racing. I was thinking, I don't know how to answer that. And so I got to searching. But one thing that I've often said over the years is the answer to almost every false doctrine is usually right there in the context. Now, what do I mean? If you look at a few verses before or a few verses after, usually you can find the answer to almost anything. So, is that true here? Yes. That's Ezekiel 16:49. But if you look at the very next verse, Ezekiel 16:50, listen what it says. It begins with the word and. What does that tell you? There's more to the story. Keep reading. So what does he say? And they were haughty, and they committed abomination. Therefore I took them away. What is he telling us in these verses? He's saying there was a progression of sin. You know, you don't have a godly nation one day and bam, the next day they support homosexuality. That's not the way it happens. There's a progression. And so what he's telling us about Sodom and Gomorrah is this. They got to the point that they were prideful, and then they got to the point that they were full of food. What does that mean? They had plenty of food. There was no hunger, abundance of idleness. They had time on their hands and leisure, and they got to the point that they were lazy, and then they were haughty, and then they committed and embraced abomination. And then the Lord says, I'd had enough. And it made me stop and think, where are we as a nation? Would you say that our nation is prideful? I would say as a nation, not Christians, but as a nation, would you say that we have abundance of food in this country? Yeah. Would you say that we have abundance of idleness and leisure in this country? Would you say that we're haughty? Would you say that we have embraced abomination? Now, you say, well, that depends on what do you mean by abomination. He's talking about Sodom and Gomorrah, and he says they got to the point that they committed abomination. Do you know what homosexuality is referred to as in the Old Testament? Listen to this. Leviticus 20 and verse 13 says this, if a man lies with another man as he would with a woman, what does that mean? That's pretty clear, isn't it? If a man lies with a man as he would with a woman. In other words, if a man has sex with a man like he would do with a woman, they have both committed abomination, and their blood shall be upon their own head. What he says is homosexuality is called abomination. Now go back and read Ezekiel 16. He says they got to the point that they were prideful, they had plenty of food, they had idleness on their hands, and they got to the point that they were engaging in abomination. And the Lord said, enough was enough, and I destroyed them. And I got to thinking about our country. We're prideful. We've got to the point that we've got plenty of food. We've got idleness on our hands. We've embraced abomination. Is there going to come a point at which the Lord says enough is enough? And it kind of scared me when I started thinking about that. I do think in the last couple of years we've rolled things back a little bit. The LGBTQ movement has slowed down. The DEI movement, we've backed off of some of these things. And so maybe we've been spared a little bit more time, and that's encouraging. But this idea that the Bible doesn't condemn homosexuality is simply not true. All right, here's the next one. I've heard people say, well, the Bible says, judge not. When people say that, I simply say this, the Bible does not say judge not. And they'll say, yeah, it does. You know, Matthew 7:1, Jesus said, judge not that you be not judged. I've got a whole sermon just on this one point, but the explanation is this. If you read Matthew 7:1 through 4, Jesus condemns a specific type of judgment. He says, judge not, and then he talks about being a hypocrite in your judgment. He talks about being hypercritical in your judgment. Don't be unfair. I tell people next to Matthew 7:1, write John 7:24, because he says there, judge not according to appearance, but be righteous in your judgment. The Bible condemns us to judge. He just says, do it the right way. Don't be a hypocrite. Don't be hypercritical and nitpick people. Make sure it's righteous judgment. Condemn the things that God condemns, is what he's saying. All right? The Bible does not say, judge not. All right? I've heard people say this, well, if homosexuality is so bad, why is it that Jesus never spoke against it? Jesus never even said the word homosexuality, much less did he condemn gay marriage. Did Jesus ever condemn gay marriage? This is what Jesus said. In Matthew chapter 19 and verse 9, Jesus said, have you not read that he that made them in the beginning made them male and female? Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. Jesus said marriage consists of a male and a female. Now, outside of marriage, sex is sinful. Inside of marriage, it has to be a male and a female. You could take those facts and you could put them in a logical syllogism, and you could prove that Jesus actually did condemn gay marriage. Let me go ahead because of time here. People will say, well, homosexuals marrying, that's a civil right that is equivalent to racially equality. In other words, back in the 60s and 70s and 80s in this country, we were fighting for racial equality. And they say it's the same thing today. We are fighting for equality for homosexuals and lesbians and transgender. They say it's the same. It is not the same. Why is it not the same? Because a person's race is not a sin. A person's race is not an activity. You can't help your race. And as a matter of fact, Acts 17 and verse 26 says, God has made of one blood every nation of men who dwell upon the face of the earth. What does that mean? Whatever your race is, God made you that way. 1 Samuel 17 and verse 6 says, God does not look on the outward appearance as man does. God looks on the heart. In other words, God doesn't care if you're black or white or Asian. That doesn't matter to God. He doesn't look on the outward appearance. He doesn't care if you're tall or short or black or white. God cares about your heart. But you see, if a person engages in homosexuality, that's not the same thing. That's a choice. That is something that the Lord has condemned. I know I'm running late here, but let me finish these two real quick. People say, well, they have a right to be married. Whether you like it or not, that is their right. But here's the thing. They're not married. It doesn't matter what the Supreme Court says, because Matthew 19 and verse 6 says, what God therefore has joined together, let not man put asunder. What does that mean? The one who actually does the joining in marriage is God. And if God doesn't join you together, you are not married. It doesn't matter what the Supreme Court says. I'll hit the last one so that we can say that we finished. I've heard people say, well, homosexual marriage is no different than heterosexual fornication. Their point is fornication is fornication. I actually heard a preacher in the Lord's church make this argument. In other words, sin is sin. If two people who are not married and they're heterosexuals have sex, the Bible says that's fornication. If two homosexuals have sex, that's fornication. And they are the same in the eyes of God. Brethren, they're not the same. God doesn't view all sins the same. I'm going to hit this very quickly and I will wrap this up. In Romans chapter 1, God calls homosexual relationships vile affections. He says that it's unnatural. He says that it's unseemly. He says that it is shameful. You look at the descriptions of homosexual relationships and heterosexual, and they are not the same in the eyes of God. All right, I wish I had more time to get into this, and the main point is, what should we do about it? How should we view it? And the answer is, very quickly, we need to love those people. And we need to teach them that they can obey the gospel, they can repent of this sin, and they can still go to heaven. Sometimes we have an attitude of a hater, and we have an attitude of we don't want anything to do with you, and that's not right. All right, if you have questions or you want any of this information or the statistics, let me know. I'd be glad to share that with you. Thank you for your attention. I appreciate it very much.